Okay, wonderful. It's my privilege to host this next hour. We're going to take an hour to really just hear the heart of these three men and also from you. Oftentimes when questions are asked, it's such a key way of seeing what people heard. Because as leaders, what you say and what people hear are not always the same thing. And so we want to provoke just thoughts and see if we can help each other into more. And some of these questions are amazing. Some of these questions have not been very kind. You know who you are. And we'll see how these guys fare. But I think what we would love to hear in the first instance from the three of you, as the angels come down. These are three amazing men, very gifted in their own right, very gifted in the kingdom, and a joy to run with and a joy to see what God is doing through them. And so we actually would love to know in the first instance, what would you say is the one thing that spoke to you most over our time together so far?
You haven't got to speak yet.
For me, it was church discipline, the importance of it. It's maybe the most difficult thing because it's easy to love people, but I think real love is to discipline people, to speak in their lives. And I've also seen that like the discipline to set somebody out of the church, I think that's very difficult, especially as a lead elder, because you carry the responsibility to make that end call, and then you are afraid to make mistakes. But I think I need to be more courageous in that, and that's what for me was the highlight.
Wonderful.
Well done, Shechaniah. I think for me, Chris's message, actually, the first message, was a really crucial message, because I think that one of the things that perhaps we have struggled with as a couple is we love ministering. We love ministry in the church. And we love spending time with people. But I think if we've learned anything over the course of this year, is that when some of the more complex, difficult, emotionally draining pastoral issues hit, you need to be able to be serving out of a place of rest where you have the emotional capacity for the benefit of people. It's not just for us. It's actually so that as we tend to our flocks, we're tending from a place of love. Because I think if we have learned anything over the course of ministry, it's when we're tired, ministry and eldership can become more about the compulsion and the legalistic side. I serve because I am called to serve, rather than I serve willingly because I love Jesus and I love the house of God. So I find Chris's message I would never preach it myself because Jonathan would just say I was a total hypocrite, I think. But I found it a really helpful, compelling message, and just excellent. But everything was good. I think Russo as well. And I'm only saying this because I want you to give the difficult questions to Jonathan and Peter. But I actually felt in Russo's message, he said something that was very powerful about being the kind of first responder. And I think that's a key thing in leadership. We all know what it's like to open the floor to our leaders and then wait. It's where Jonathan's famous phrase, "no faffing," has come from. He doesn't like waiting for people to respond. And I thought the Shechaniah principle was really powerful and excellent.
I could say what they said. I think what has encouraged me over these few days is basically everybody who spoke out of their grace zone. So that's an important, lesson that I've learned. We planned it that way, but if you're going to speak anywhere, you need to be living it in order for it to be effective. And if you're going to go into any church and speak, we chatted over lunch, you need to ask, if a person's going to speak on any topic, then you need to look over their shoulder. Are they living? There's a lot of people that are living it. Have they done it? So for me, that's kind of the most encouraging thing. Not that I've heard, but that has come out of the conference. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we do have some more time this afternoon, so please, the relational element of this is as important as what has been shared. And part of this is to get into the lives of those around you and learn from them and build bridges. So please use every moment you can. Here's the question. How do you develop a desire for leadership. And I interpret this to mean you perhaps see leadership on someone. They don't necessarily see it themselves. How do you develop that desire in that person for leadership?
Okay, I'll go first because I'm a very good example actually of somebody who had no desire for leadership. And honestly, before I met Jonathan, church leadership was not something that was at all on my agenda. I was a music producer. I loved the work that I did. I enjoyed it. And what Jonathan did, that I see him do repeatedly actually, and I think that has really caught in our team and that we all imitate, is to develop a desire in somebody to be a leader. They must know that there's something in them to develop. And until there's a call on our lives, it's very hard to start to believe beyond the things that we already believe about ourselves. So I had come through a family of preachers. My granddad was a preacher, my dad was a preacher, my brother was a preacher. I didn't want to be the one that couldn't preach, and so I thought, well, the best thing to do is never to try. And then I met Jonathan. He had me over, I preached a little bit here, and I went to see him and asked him, or he asked me, what is your primary gifting? And I said, well, it's worship. And he said, no, you're going to be a teacher and preacher. And he called something out, and I can still remember going home and telling my dad. And when I told my dad, he goes, you? Who said that? And I said, well, he's from Ireland. And my dad goes, yeah, that explains a lot. So I do think we must constantly be building up, calling out, identifying, and to speak repeatedly to that thing, because I think that very often when we say these things to people, they don't initially see it, but when we've called it out, we then need to create an environment in which that gifting can practice. And if there's no space to practice, it's one thing to call it out, but once the person actually begins to minister in that grace zone, and people begin to affirm what we have seen, then I think we see the anointing starting to grow towards leadership.
I think the best leaders are the ones that don't see themselves as a leader. So if you feel I'm not able to lead, you are probably in a good space. Also biblical, because a lot of guys in the Bible that get a calling, they felt unworthy, unabled. I felt it as well when I was called. And the Bible also teaches in Timothy that it's good to desire to be an elder. So I think it's not bad to have a desire for leadership, but I think it's very good to be honest to yourself and ask yourself, why do I want to be a leader? Because if it's anything to do with identity, you won't make it. I think you can make it in the world, but in the house of God, if there is fleshy desires or things in your identity, you will early or later, you will face yourself.
I always find that verse, he who desires to be an elder is a noble thing, challenging, because I think everybody I've met who's ever desired to be an elder have had the wrong attitude. I don't think I've met one person in our context. So I know the Bible says that, but it's a hard thing to manage. But so as Peter says, it's the people who don't think that they can preach, don't think that they can lead. That's actually where I'm looking. Yeah. And then you try to call it out. I haven't been always very good. That was just a momentary lapse with Euan. Yeah. Yeah. Normally, I just see the problems, yes. So, I don't know what happened that day. Yeah. So, try to call it out. Give people responsibility. How do you, give them responsibility? Risk on youth, risk on experience, never risk on character. Yeah.
Very good. Let me try and stay within the theme here. There's a question submitted that goes along these lines of what you touched on there. And the question is this: what are the differences in character between leaders in the secular world and leaders in the kingdom? And do you see a difference?
I think we need to be careful not to generalize, but I'll generalize. It feels as if in the world or in secular environment that, you know, your personal life and your public life can be compartmentalized. So, you know, you can vote in the politician from hell because of what that politician can do, there's a moral failure, there's all this type of thing, but we're not worried about the person's personal life. We're actually, so for me, that's the big difference. So actually, for me as an elder, what qualifies me or disqualifies me initially is my family life.
Very good.
So the church is a family. If I can't lead my family, I can't lead the church. Now, the problem is most churches like ours have just become like the world, and all they look at is gift. I think I said recently, when I stand at the front and preach, you see the depth of my gift. When I go through hard times or when I go through big successes, you see my character.
Very good. Very good, yeah.
So for me, that's the differentiation but I think most Pentecostal charismatic churches, unfortunately, follow the world. And when there are deep flaws in a leader, they hide sin and they stick people up whose character isn't able to sustain their gifting.
Power. Any one of you want to add to that? Very good.
Another difference is authority. In the world, you have authority and you have to actually use your power and authority to rule and reign the company, to give instructions. I think in the kingdom, the leader is the server, is serving and can't use his authority. The authority is coming from underneath. The saints need to honor the leader without the leader is controlling, without using his authority. And that's the big difference, I think, between a worldly leader and a godly leader.
I think maybe one final thing I would add, that we see many very gifted businessmen who have raised up incredibly successful businesses. And perhaps if I notice one thing is that strategy that works in the world doesn't work in the church. And very often one of the challenges, I think, in bringing successful businessmen through into successful leaders in the church is that many of our problems are solved by faith. They're solved by the things that we can't solve in our own wisdom. And so I think there's been many occasions where we've had to shape men that have come from a successful business life to say, I understand that you can solve your problems by strategy and by your own intellect in the world. But this problem will not be solved by any of those things. This is a time for prayer. It's a time for hearing the Lord, and it's a time to apply faith. And that can sometimes be a very difficult transition to make from living by what we see to living by faith. But I would say that generally we've got some excellent business leaders who are faith-filled men and then take the principles of the kingdom and even see those principles bless their businesses as well.
And that's wonderful. I wonder, Chris, if you wanted to add anything to that. True. Please.
I mean, I think that is, I joke salary, but the things you value are so different. The things that the world and business leaders value is ambition, promotion, structure charts, size of responsibility, all those things. Whereas in church leadership, you value the exact opposite. You value others succeeding, others running ahead, others, carrying responsibility. And that upside down world, I think, is a massive difference. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. One of the beautiful things about our culture as a movement is to be in one another's lives. And to that end, Jonathan spoke a little bit earlier about hosting and getting into each other's space where we see what's actually behind the closed doors. And it's so rich, such a rich time. Last night we were sitting together just before dinner, Peter and Effie, we were looking at movies and previews to movies. And we watched the preview to the movie Hacksaw Ridge. Anybody here see that movie? So Hacksaw Ridge is this phenomenal story of the most unlikely of people becoming really the hero of the narrative. It's beautiful. And to that end, there's a question asked here. In our midst here, there is 50% men and 50% women. And so we'd love to know, in our context, how do those two marry? Because how do we see women in terms of leadership in this movement? And love to hear your thoughts in that regard, please.
I think they normally marry in a marriage ceremony.
Yeah. So as a movement, we are blessed with so many women ministry gifts. I always, for my theology, I always start in the garden. God created Adam, and out of Adam, he created Eve. He didn't take her from his head, to rule over him. He didn't take her from his feet for him to trample upon, but he took her from his side as an equal. And so I think that's a starting point for men and women in life, that actually men and women are equal under God, and men and women have ministry under God. And then you see in the garden, however, man is given a responsibility. And so she took of the fruit, but the Bible says that death and sin came into this world by Adam. Well, how'd that happen? Because he was holding her hand back. While she was led astray, he's holding her hand back. He has a God-given responsibility. Dominion is given to them. God sees them as one. Genesis 5:2 says, Adam may have called her Eve, baby-making machine, but God called them Adam. I think it's an important point. God called them. God saw them as one. So, you'll see in the context of 4:12, men and women, husband and wife working together in ministry together. And we see that throughout the Bible, but guys have a responsibility before God that the wife doesn't have. Just like elders have responsibilities before God, the deacons don't, Deacons get to do all the serving, but they don't have to carry the responsibility. They don't have to carry the weight. So we want to see men and women serving. We want to see men and women in the decision process. I'm married. I've got 4 daughters. Annette and I discuss things, hopefully, or we're going to go there, we're going to go here. We discuss things together. On most occasions, we're just discussing, and it's one mind. But then there's times that I need to, under God, take the responsibility for our team. Under God, I have the responsibility as the head of my home. That's a Bible phrase. As the head of my home, I have the responsibility before God to set a trajectory. It doesn't mean that every single day I'm making all those decisions. Normally, they're in a flow. And then there are forks that come in the road. And in my home, I need to take that responsibility and lead my family in that way. And so in the life of the church then as well, you'll see women serving in so many different contexts, but the elders, the guys, have that ultimate responsibility. And so I'll just go a little bit longer, because probably it's what in some people's minds. So a healthy eldership team is husbands and wives working together. A healthy one, we're not always that healthy. Husbands and wives discussing together, and you need the grace of everybody on that team. You want to hear everybody's voice. And generally, you come to a consensus. This is what we should be doing. And then sometimes, it's actually, what should we be doing? And the husbands or the lead guy has to take a responsibility on that. I can maybe add something else, but I'll add it later. So what was the question?
It was about Euan's hair.
Right. What was the question? Just repeat it.
Women and their role in leadership in our movement.
So you can see the church is led by elders. The local church is led by elders, elder couples. They're one flesh. So I'll not appoint a couple, if they're not united in this one heart, one mind, one vision, doesn't matter how gifted the guy is, because they're together, they're one. And if he's going to be out late at night and he's been called out to pray, anoint with oil, healing, and or he's having to go the extra mile, and she's not on the same page as him, then it's not good. So eldership couples, but we are different. Biologically, I know what the world says, but we are biologically different, aren't we? Right, in function. And the same is true in spiritual function. We are biologically different, but we need both to complete one another. There may be more in-depth things they want to say.
Maybe just a further kind of degree of perspective, and to give an example, is I think that the perspective of women is something that is highly valued in our teams. So to give an example, recently we had a team meeting where we had our elders and deacons together, and we were considering a particular matter together. I had a view. I don't think it was necessarily a God view. It wasn't really something I'd particularly thought about, and very often you'll have questions that just arise in the meeting. So I gave a perspective which seemed reasonable, and then Yanel, Gustav's wife, said, well, I actually have a slightly different view. She was very gentle, but she raised the view, and as she spoke, I said, I think we've heard the mind of God. I think that's what God is saying. I don't think he's saying what I'm saying. I think he's saying what she's saying. And so we followed a decision that was made by one of the elders' wives. And I think that is important, that we value women in the church. And I think if we go back to the garden and consider the consequences of the fall, the consequence was that the woman would want to usurp the authority of the man. And so I think when we see women reaching for authority, there's something that is not aligning properly with the governance of God. But counter to that is the fact that the man would want to rule over the woman, and not positively, but to crush her down. And I think one of the things we try to do in the context of our movement is while we understand that government and the responsibility of eldership is a male function, the woman's perspective is inseparable from that too, because she is one with each man. And I think it's really important that we make space for women to minister. If we look at the prophetic nature of the church, I would say in our own context in the west of the island, that the prophetic broke open through women. It was mainly women who would prophesy into the life of the church. And I would say over the course of my time in ministry, I feel like women tend to be more front-footed in the things of the Spirit. And then the men, I think it helps to almost break things open. But then we've got to find the balance of how each person plays their position. But I think in our context we have very wide open spaces for women.
I think a leader or a head of the family or a man's role as a leader, I think it's a worldly thought to think that you are more important, that you are higher, you know. I think that's not the principle of the kingdom of God. I think that the Lord, like Paul, he is calling himself the least of all. So it's not the Lord. We have a picture of, okay, if you are higher in the hierarchy, you are more important, you are more valuable, but it's just a role to play. That doesn't, for example, we are leaders, it doesn't mean that we are more important. It's just a role that we play. And I think it's in family the same. It's the Lord, it doesn't make me as more important than Avia. It's my role, and he made me as a man, and with a man there become characters and gifting. And if I do the role as I play, I'm effective. But if Avia does the same, together we come to the full purpose of the marriage. I think it's the same in the church. If I am as a leader, play my role, not as I am the highest authority, I just play my role and everybody does it, then we come to the full potential. And I think we need to watch out to think worldly by that when a man is leading, that he's more important. It's not more important, it's just a role to play.
Trust. I forgot what the first one is. Yeah, the last one. I mean, the last one, and I mean, I'm just saying ultimately somebody needs to lead, you know. So another, just to confuse you, no, I'll go to the first point then. So I think where most churches get confused is ministry and governance. Ministry, most churches don't have a clue. And I'm not saying that pridefully. Like the guy that Chris always quotes with those initials RW. I mean, he just made this terrible statement in the last 6 months. I mean, I used to look up to him, and I think my interns could talk theologically more about ministry and governance than he did in his 4 arguments for having men and women exactly the same function in the church. And so we just think there's ministry, and we're all called to ministry. And then there's governance. And if you can just get those, understand those two, we want to set a playing field for everyone to play, as Wimber would have said. Everybody gets to play. Everybody gets to minister. But the order and the governance of heaven comes through the dads of the house. And Jesus could have been totally countercultural and appointed female apostles, but he didn't. Because men have a responsibility in the house that women don't. He had women on his team and women who financed him and stuff like that. But he could have made the example, okay, I'm going to do things differently than has happened throughout all of salvation history. But no, we're going actually the governance side of things. And then it even goes to, you know, a little aside. You know, sometimes I lead the team, and it's a very flat leadership. Hopefully you've noticed that. Jesus is the chief shepherd. He's the senior pastor. I just happen to lead the team, try to bring out the best in the team. That's why I wasn't at the front for every session, because I'm trying to bring them. You must increase, you must, yeah. So, but in my team, sometimes we can't fully hear the mind of God. And sometimes even on the team, this is just to kind of really confuse you. Like these guys have to be like a wife to me. Yeah, where actually they realize that I need to make the call on this. And we haven't got, like James in Acts chapter 15. You take all the perspective, everybody has perspective, there is an agreement here, but we need to make a decision. And so you understand, on the team even, they're having to say, okay, you have a role, you have a responsibility in this. And it's a very rare exception, but so we're normally playing team. This whole school of leadership was the whole team that planned this over a day. And how are we going to do it? And who's graced for this and that? Not me going up the mountain like Moses and coming down with the 10 words and saying, this is what we're doing. It was a team that did this. But there were some things that needed to be called, and then that's what the team leader does. And in a marriage, they're working together as a team. Some things need to be called. That's what the husband has to do. And in the life of the church, you're working together as a team, and then there's times to call thing, and then the husbands, the guys have to call it. Does that make sense?
Very good.
Have I been controversial there?
No. I think it's worthwhile for us to have taken slightly longer on this particular subject because it's so important to get it right. It's worth for us getting this right so that everybody runs in the fullness of what the Lord has entrusted to them. A next question then, and the fact that it's here means that I think it's worth addressing just again. It says, how do I keep my relationship and my marriage healthy when doing ministry so my partner is not overwhelmed or overlooked or neglected? It's a question of balance in marriage. So could you give us some insight there, please?
I can answer that question. What we do is we try to walk every night. So even if it's getting late, people leave late, we try to walk for half an hour. And when we walk, we talk, we process. We do ministry a lot of time together. But we try to walk. I think that's our way of processing and getting our marriage healthy. Very good. Because when we are on the couch, we are often on the phone or the children are in the conversation. And when we walk, we are together. And even if it's half an hour, it keeps our marriage fresh.
So I think what we're hearing is it's very proactive rather than reactive in the rhythm of your life. Euan.
I think one of the things that's incredibly important for every leader is to be able to say no to things in church life, because the reality is the pressures never stop. Every year we go into ministry, I say to Karen, this will be less busy than last year. And for 14 years on the trot, it's been busier the next year than any previous year. And I think one of the things that we've been faced with this year is we've had huge numbers of deliverances in across the whole of our church, but it's put massive burden on us pastorally and just in terms of the hours that are going into ministry, where we will, we've had days where we've literally sat with a person for 10 hours and just delivered people, and it's happened regularly. And I think one of the things that we began to recognize, that with the intensity of ministry in our home, even though we were ministering together, our children were being impacted. We were at home, but we weren't present. And one of the things that we've really been trying to do since the summer is just to manage the expectations of people. Part of that comes through building a team and having others that are able to do the things that we just don't have the capacity to do. So we are raising up other leaders who are able to do the same ministries. And then we have to train our people to not be disappointed if they don't see a lead elder or a pastor. We need to train our people to know that you can see any elder, you can see our deacons, you can see a life group leader. They're able to fulfill the ministry of the church. And so I think for us, as we've learned to say no to people without feeling, we've hurt them or they're going to be disappointed in us, I just don't think that as ministers we can live under the weight of another person's disappointment, because we have to manage our own health as well. We have to manage the balance of our homes, because if the home fails, the church will fail. And so the home must be the first port of call, and it must be healthy. And if we lose the balance of tending to the people in our own home, we are hardly likely to be able to care properly for the church itself.
I mean, I think I've shared with you before, at one time Annette would have rated our marriage 2 or 3 out of 10. And up until recently, she said it was 8.5 out of 10. Now, I do know that there are things she would like me to address, but what are we doing differently, Annette? I'm not going to answer it. Yeah, I know. No. You have to answer.
We want to know about that 0.5,
so,
please.
What are we doing differently? Give her the microphone, please. What are we doing differently that might have taken our marriage to a better place, healthier? I know there's things we still need to change. We haven't got enough time for that.
Yeah, I think we've had 3 girls who've left the home at the same time, so the changes have come very quickly. But we've made sure that the kids that are still at home are coming with us on mission trip or ministry trip or whatever, that we're doing it together. I'm traveling more because I can, because the kids are, which is a great season to be in.
When you walk into the Stanfield home, it's warm and it's receptive and there's joy and there's peace in that house. When you walk into Euan and Kaz's home, you're received well. It's an environment of life. I have not walked into Peter and Effie's home yet, but I feel it'll be the same. And there's a responsibility for us as leaders. I think what they're highlighting here, in that intentionality. If our saints come into our homes and it's horrible, it doesn't matter what you preach. It doesn't matter what your ministry is going to be like. You have to create that environment first. I think Euan said that. So thank you so much for that, gentlemen. I'm going to change trajectory here a little bit. We're in the last third of our hour together. And here is something that I think is very, very important. A question has been asked here in terms of investing in people, in terms of even perhaps helping them through discipline. Sometimes in our desire to want to restore and even call out the best in them, we could fall into the trap of perhaps making promises. How do we inspire without making promises that will trip us up later?
I'll go first, and the guys can think. And this is a very simple thing, is perspective. I think when we've been in the course of a very heavy duty discipline issue over 11 months of the year. And at times, because you love people and you're very close friends with people, it's very difficult always to hold your perspective in tension with the fact that you really, really love these people. You are so for them and you want to see them return to health. But meanwhile, we actually experience trauma as pastors and leaders. Sometimes we can almost feel the same effect of something like a broken marriage in the way that the people in the marriage themselves feel it. So you get pulled into these very traumatic situations. And at times it's incredibly difficult to keep perspective. And even this year at one point, something that I found very helpful was Russo actually just phoned me and said that, can we meet for coffee? And we went for coffee, and he challenged me. He said, do you think you've still got your eye on the bigger picture? Or do you think you've been so dragged into the issue that perhaps there are elements of leadership that he didn't say it like this, but there are elements of leadership that you're not looking after properly. That's what I heard. And I found that really, really helpful to be pulled out of the mire of the situation and to have my perspective checked and opened again. And I think that one thing I really appreciate about Living Hope is the strength of our team. And I think there's never a lack of perspective in the team. I think if you're functioning as one elder on your own, or you're in a team where there isn't the balance or the plurality of leadership, it's very, very difficult to keep your perspective when you are the one that's dealing with the trauma and the emotion of a situation. And it's so helpful to sometimes have somebody who will come alongside you, just say, look, I love you, I see what's happening, but you're going to have to start putting boundaries around the way that this is unfolding, or it's going to damage you. And I think because we've all been there, all leaders have been through these things, it's not unique to us. But when other leaders have been through it and have learned lessons in the process, it's incredibly helpful to have a friend who would just come along and open your eyes, challenge your perspective, and perhaps even help to steer you into a slightly healthier direction in the way that we are dealing with these things. So perspective is key. Plurality of leadership is key.
I think there is always a risk with people giving perspective, but there is also a risk with people giving not perspective. And I think in many situations we choose to be safe and not giving perspective because we think, oh, maybe they're going to grasp, maybe they're going to feel it like a promise. But I think from my perspective, give more perspective, because often it builds faith. And you can just ask questions like to check people's heart. As you know, in the Netherlands, we ask quite straight questions. So we can just ask, people, are you grasping for your perspective or what, So I think we have to realize when we don't give perspective, we take a risk as well.
Thank you, guys. I'll answer from a different direction. How do you stop somebody? What's really the question is really, how do you stop?
How do we help them not to receive maybe promises that they see, like, Jonathan said this, therefore that will happen?
So a proverb I keep quoting is reliable communication permits progress. So I'm going to talk about, if I've had a meeting with anybody, I'm hopefully never going to say that in the meeting, but you never know what people hear in a meeting. And so if it's any difficult meeting or any meeting about their future, then I'm going to send a little email afterwards with 3 bullet points and saying, this is what we discussed and this is what we said, bang, bang, bang. Is that what you understand? And that stops people running away. But because the crazy thing is, Like people have thought that they'll be leading churches and all sorts of things, and there's never been the slightest conversation. Never. But what people hear and what you say. So I'm just on the practical. I've kind of moved from giving people dots to join up to no filters. Some people might have picked that up. And no filters, and just kind of putting it as clearly as I can. And especially in the recap of sensitive meetings about the future and stuff like that are difficult. Okay, here's just to recap. This is what we agreed. This is what I'll do. This is what you'll do. Is that your understanding of the meeting?
That is essential. I love Jonathan's final point there. Even in meetings of lesser importance or lesser weight, to have the courage to just ask, what did you hear? What did you hear? Thank you, gentlemen. That is fantastic. Here's something that might help us just understand boundaries and honor and the correct way forward. The question really pertains to what to do appropriately if you perceive that your leader is in the wrong. And not just wrong in terms of an opinion, but perhaps wrong in terms of a blind spot or whatever. How do we move that forward? When do we connect with the apostolic, if at all? Just talk us through that, please.
So I think all of us, to qualify for leadership, eldership, I need to be hospitable. Actually, the word hospitable in the Bible is made up of two words, philoxenos, loving strangers. So that means true biblical hospitality isn't having those you know round to your house, it's having strangers, those on the periphery of the church. So you should, if you're going to lead the way Jesus would want us to lead, your house is an open house. Anybody can come to your house. And so I would like to think, we had a guy that ended up leaving the church. His first point of complaint was me. And then, so he came to my house, had a coffee. I just said, ask as many questions as you want. And there are no secrets in our church. And I answered him, and he was satisfied then, but he actually had something in him, and then he went after somebody. But I just think the principle, it would be to start. There's no, in the nicest way, there's no hierarchy. We're all saints, ultimately. We have different functions. And so come and, what is your concern, or what have you seen? And it may be that they need to go, if I'm deaf to that, they could go to the elders. The reason for having genuine apostolic teams through. See, often people talk about, I've talked about this with some of the guys, covering. We need a covering. This church wants a covering. What they mean is they want a guy to come in once a year, pat them on the back, and leave with a nice honorarium in their back pocket. That isn't how 412 works. So everybody knows our apostolic team, and they can contact them directly. I would like to think in the first instance, if they thought there was a problem, they would just come to me and say, when you did this, help me understand. I felt this way. I've heard, etc. And just come and speak to you. And if they're not satisfied, there are other elders. And if we are tone deaf, there are apostolic team they can pick up the phone to anytime and say, my elders are just not listening. And it might be a member of the apostolic team comes in and takes it forward from there. And they are trusted because they are working relationally. Like if you remember 1 Corinthians, Paul says, I've heard from Chloe's household. Chloe isn't even an elder. And yet there's a relationship between Paul, the lead apostle, and this household where maybe a home group was happening. And she was obviously speaking to him. So we need to have 360 degrees accountability. Yeah, doors open. But then, for everybody, everything must be established among 2 or more witnesses. And elders are going to be at the front of the firing line. So love believes the best.
I think a crucial question that every elder must ask when anyone comes with any information is, have you gone one-to-one? And I think that where so much hurt can be created and division can be created in teams is if the person that is the accusation against has not actually been properly approached and the claim properly outlined to them to say, this is the issue we are having. And I think that what we see from time to time is where either somebody is not prepared to have that difficult conversation, and in 412 we talk about the 5% conversations. It's saying the 5% that nobody else is going to say to you. But that's often the section or that's what you need to hear in order for your life to change. We talk so much around the 95% of things that we already know that don't transform us, that don't change us. And I think that if we skip the first step in going to a brother and saying, this is my complaint against you, then actually you're compromising other people, because then you then take a complaint to either another elder or to an apostle who now has second-hand gossip on their hands. And they are now in a compromised position where even to go back to the original elder without them being properly addressed is unbiblical. And so it's key that we have the difficult conversations and are actually able to address things one-to-one. And I think in our team, I can't think of a time where we've had to skip Jonathan or Jonathan skip us, because there is that openness to have the direct conversation to say, this is the complaint. And I think things resolve generally very quickly.
I think the answer is not in every situation the same, because it's different when there is a healthy team. So when there is really a problem in a team, for example, the lead elder is controlling, and that can happen that the guys in his team also feel controlled, so that saints feel like I can speak to elders, but it feels like that there is but because there is a culture of honor maybe in the church, that can happen. And I will recommend, if you are in a situation where you feel like I'm not heard even by the elders, not by the team, because there is control, then I will recommend just go to the apostolic. In my church, I will say to everybody, if you feel you have to go, there's always an open door to the apostolic, but the right way is first go to me or to the person you have an issue with. And I think the apostolic will ask first, have you spoken to Peter? But if you say, yeah, but it's not safe to speak to Peter because he's not listening or he's controlling, and if I speak to Flores, Flores is afraid for Peter because otherwise, then all... Yeah, but then always every saint need to know that if you feel not heard, there is an open door to the apostolic, because that means actually that there is safety. Because then I shouldn't be afraid that somebody goes to the apostolic, because if there is an issue, I want to know that it will be exposed, because I want to be a good leader. And if I have a blind spot, if I'm doing wrong, rather to hear it from the apostolic than when Jesus is returning and he reveals, then you have serious problems,
Andrew, Liz, would you like to add anything to that? Or we'll give you a moment. You happy with that? Please, Chris.
Just, I think I heard from the Christian, maybe in the team, if you're disagreeing with what the lead guy is saying, how can you raise that? And just practically, there is ways you can raise disagreement without it feeling like confrontation and very aggressive, So there's a posture in which you can raise disagreement quite well, which is sort of saying, look, I'm seeing it differently to the way you're seeing it. So just help me understand where you're coming from on this, and maybe my perspective will come in line with yours. But just so you know, I'm feeling it differently to you, and this is maybe why. But let me hear why you are where you are, because until you know the other side, you don't always know the full story, because there may be reasons why they're feeling that you don't know. So you've immediately thought, well, he's wrong, but he might, in the bigger picture, have more than you do. Yeah.
Eric. Thank you for that, Chris. Also, I think experience would show many of us that when there's a problem or a perceived problem, it's rarely as urgent as having to act on it immediately. generally there is time to posture yourself correctly and approach it, and allow for time for response and perspective, etc. So that's very helpful. One of our goals, so to speak, in moments like this, as we come to the end of our hour here, is to demonstrate tangibly that you don't have to run alone. If you have a look at everybody in the hall here, in the ministry, one of the primary lies the enemy would bring is, you are alone. You are isolated. You have to deal with this on your own. And really, hopefully, this demonstrates that doesn't have to be the case. And so for us to be able to draw not just within a local context or our local teams, but actually across congregations and across churches and even across nations on one another's wealth of knowledge. And so to that end, I'd love to ask the final question, which would be this. What would be the best way to draw practically on this resource? How can we get the best out of one another in this context?
I think at the moment, obviously, for instance, Jonathan and I are dealing, and Andrew and Liz are also involved in a situation in another church that is a 412 church where there have been some challenges in leadership, and the elders have come directly to us where there have been a series of meetings that have just been incredibly helpful, I think, for the church that we are with. And so initially, when the issue was raised, it began with a Zoom conference with basically all of the elders from the church, and with Jonathan and myself just listening to what had happened and reflecting on a potential process that may help the church to work through the issue in a biblical way. So the guys who are dealing with the problem are not dealing on their own. They're not trying to make up a process, but they're actually hearing from, particularly from Jonathan, who has dealt with things like this before, of the best way, not just to process the eldership team, but when there's a failure in leadership, there has to be a process for the church as well to settle the church so that there is no disunity in the church. There's no unsettledness in the congregations. And so how do we actually help the church to process what is going on? And that requires a whole volume of different skills to come into the situation. So, for instance, it may be that Kaz and I go in to do some ministry with a person for deliverance and for freedom ministry with somebody. It may be that Andrew and Liz, who are there at the moment, are working through pastoral ministry, through counseling, through helping each person in the team just to process things properly. And then for Jonathan to bring an apostolic perspective of how do you help this situation to be resolved within the church? How do the leaders deal with it? And so there's coaching, there's counseling, there's help on hand that even would help the lead guys that are speaking publicly. These are the things that the church need to hear from you. These are the things that you need to be thinking about. These are the next steps that you need to be processing, not just this month, but even in January, in February. These are the building blocks that we need to be working through in order to recover the situation. But of course, our skills are much broader than that. So we're very used to being called into churches where the guys may say, look, we have a problem in worship. We just feel like we come to you and your worship is so alive. Our worship feels really dead. How can we help? So we might take teams of worshipers with Nikki, with me perhaps, and we go in, we teach, and we begin to impart what we know until we begin to see the culture of the church shifting and changing. And that is the beautiful thing about 412, that earlier in the year, we ran a school of supernatural. We thought, well, which kind of weird people do we know that are into that kind of thing? Nadine Bardenhorst, brilliant, she can come across. And actually just reaching into the field. And that is the work of the apostolic. Where there is a lack, the apostolic will provide, and the apostolic will fill in what needs to be supplied to that church. And we do this all the time. We're doing it right now. We're supplying for lacks in leadership across our European churches and beyond. And it's just an amazing resource to be able to go to this huge field of people with very, very differing anointings, giftings, and abilities. And when we see a lack, to say, we think we need help, and the apostolic team can say, we think the best person for this would be this person, and we'll send them in, they'll come, they'll help, they'll give themselves to you. It's just incredible. If you're not in 412, you need it.
Another thing is be proactive. I think proactivity is very important. Don't expect that apostolic sees everything, but if you feel I'm unequipped, I want to know more about this, I have a lack in my church about that, go to the guy that is apostolic, ask him questions. So be proactive. A lot of time I heard even in the church that people feel like, the leaders are busy. And of course, we are not sitting on the couch, although we do now. No, but of course we are busy. But I think what I love to do is answering questions, people that come with a help question. And I know if I have a question, Euan is always say, I'm always available, you know. So, and I know he's busy, but I know that he loves when I ask him questions, when I struggle with this, and I can ask Jonathan. So be proactive. Don't think the apostolic is busy. Don't think it's a silly question. I think I grew because I didn't know anything. When I planted, I didn't know even anything about the Holy Spirit. And I just phoned, guys, how does that work? How does, and it feels like I'm stupid. I'm leading a church and I don't know how it, I remember that I watched a video from Andrew Shelley, like Spirit-led church, and I thought I'm disqualified, and I phoned him like, Andrew, I can't, it's literally, but I can't lead a church because it needs to be Spirit-led, and I don't know how to do it. And he said, no, just go on, and he just gave me handles, and with that handles I practiced and I grew, but I have asked a lot of questions. Many times I asked Ryan, Andrew, Jonathan, Euan, and they helped me, and I grew because I was proactive, and I think, and I was just traveling, the Lord reminded me, I was traveling to, we had a day extra because of the cancellations of the flights, and I spoke with the guy, and he was so proactive with opening his life, and he was asking many questions, and through that, all these questions, we get connection. I was able to share and to talk about his questions, and I think proactivity is key.
Very good.
Yeah, so to conclude, be front-footed. There's a whole lot of grace about. Ask, I can help you coordinate. I can open up doors for you. I'm not the man. There's so much grace here. Just ask. We need this help. We need that help. Yeah. Go to the app. Speaking to somebody, and they just said, I've never heard of 412. This is the first 412 thing I've been to, and I've just been chewing on everything on the app. There's a search engine there. Just feed as much as you can. Our movement, with this I'll conclude, is called 412, not 411. 411, as in Ephesians 4:11, is when Jesus ascended on high. That's after his death and resurrection, then he ascends. After that, he gave gifts: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. 2, 4, 12. Equip the saints for the work of the ministry. So that is our heart, not to be on the platform. Our heart is to ensure that we help local elders and congregations equip their saints for the work of the ministry. That's what we do.